Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 3 of the second round playoff series between the San Jose Barracuda and the Colorado Eagles, in which the Barracuda have lost 3-2 in overtime. This was the first game of the series taking place in Colorado, and in fact the first game of these playoffs as a whole that would be taking place in Colorado, because the Eagles got to bypass the first round due to being the top seed in the Pacific Division. But not only are they the best team in the Pacific, but they are actually the best team in the entire AHL when it comes to playing in front of their home crowd, which, as I said, they would be doing for the first time here. And so really the objective for the Barracuda in the first period of this game was quite simple. They just needed to survive. They needed to hang on and not find themselves in too much of a hole heading into the rest of this game. And they only just barely managed to do that, as within the first couple of minutes, the Eagles strike first to make it 1-0, and then the last couple of minutes of the first period, they make it 2-0. But there were many close calls between those two goals. I think they hit 3 or 4 posts/crossbars, so with a little bit less luck, the Barracuda probably find themselves 3-0, 4-0, maybe even more than that in the hole. But instead, it is just a couple of goals, which is not completely insurmountable, but we have seen the Eagles do an exceptionally good job of shutting things down in the neutral zone and really preventing the Barracuda from getting much generated when it comes to the 5-on-5 play. And that actually did not change here tonight. As I mentioned last game, the only 5-on-5 goal for the Barracuda thus far in this series was that lucky bounce on a Colin Graff shot in Game 1. That continued here tonight. Still no 5-on-5 goal scoring actually happening, but they didn't need it to actually come back in this game. Thanks to some great goaltending from Askarov through the second and third period, they slowly but surely clawed their way back. In that middle frame, the Barracuda actually did improve. They finally started to get some shots on net, and Philip Bistet cut the lead in half with a power play goal to make it 2-1 after 40 minutes. And then the third period, despite the first 17 minutes passing with not much going on, again due to that really suffocating neutral zone play from Colorado, eventually they get Askarov out, they get the extra attacker on the ice, and that seemed to provide an extra boost that the Barracuda needed to tie this one up pretty quickly. A goal from Pavel Regenda off of some chaos in front of the net, and that made it 2-2, and we went to the overtime. And as we know, overtime, a completely clean slate. It does not matter what happened in the first 60 minutes. Now it is next goal wins territory, and in the previous game, the Barracuda had managed to get that next goal within just the first 30 seconds. Of course, it was due to a power play that they would not have this time, but still, the Barracuda showed that they had that clutch ability to win these types of games, and it seemed as though they might be able to do that quite early on here. But just 2 minutes into the post-regulation play, into this overtime, there is a stoppage here. It's not to clean the ice or anything like that, just a normal 30 seconds before you drop the puck again for another faceoff, and we see Askarov head to the bench, and first instinct is maybe this is some sort of equipment issue, but he actually leaves the game entirely, and Gabe Carrier, the Barracuda's backup goaltender, has to step in. And not only is this just generally a downgrade, no offense to Carrier, but Askarov being one of, if not the best goaltenders in the AHL, you're kind of losing out by not having him between the pipes. But also just sending in a goaltender completely cold like this is a really, really tough spot for Carrier to handle. Not to mention the fact that this is a playoff overtime. One singular goal ends this game and puts the Barracuda in a really tough spot in this series, which they now find themselves in, down 2-1, needing to win the last 2 games to survive and make it to the next round. And the word after this one ends up happening, because just a few minutes into it, even though the Barracuda did a pretty good job of limiting shots at first, eventually something's going to come and it beats Carrier clean here. The word is that Askarov left with minor cramps. Now, minor would imply that this is not a huge deal, but I guess it was enough to get him to leave this game, even though it was a playoff overtime. But the big thing here for the Barracuda is that they actually play another game tomorrow. Game 4 is tomorrow. I don't know why this is the case. In the NHL, they would never have back-to-back games in the playoffs, but I guess the AHL does things a little bit differently. There's not as much of an emphasis on that. So already Askarov would have to go in back-to-back games almost certainly, and there's a fatigue aspect to it. But now, if there is these minor cramps, whether or not he actually is able to get over it, or maybe he thinks he'll be fine tomorrow and then it comes a big issue during the game again, this is starting to become a question mark for the Barracuda moving forward, and considering Askarov has been and will need to continue to be the most important player on this roster, any issues actually occurring with him is a huge deal for this team and cannot be treated lightly. So we'll see what happens. It seems as though the confidence is that Askarov will play tomorrow, but you never know what could end up happening. These cramps seem to have come out of nowhere, and they can always reappear. When it comes to the players to talk about, we saw a couple of lineup substitutions here made by John McCarthy, as well as a bit of a lineup blender. This occurred back in the latter half of last game, so that part wasn't a surprise, but a couple of the players stepping in was. I'll get to that a little bit later. First, we start off with the top line: Walker Duehr, Colin White, Colin Graf. The big story here tonight was definitely Colin White, who left this game with an injury. I haven't talked about him at all really in these playoffs, simply because he doesn't really fit into the Sharks' future of this team, but he has been very, very useful thus far for the Barracuda. 6 points in his first 4 games, and he left this game rather early on, just the first couple minutes of the first period, which put the Barracuda down a center very early on, so a lot of extra shifts needing to be taken on here, so that was definitely tough. When it comes to the other 2 players on this line, one thing that I will briefly mention about Walker Duehr, there were some good moments for him throughout this game, not as much consistency as you would like to see, but he's very good at possessing the puck. He moves pretty well. The major issue here tonight for Duehr was actually on this game-winning goal. He makes a crucial mistake here, committing to a hit in a situation he should never do so, because the Eagles have possession of the puck, and Duehr comes in when there's already 2 Barracuda forwards in the offensive zone. That leads to a 4-on-2 rush the other way for Colorado, and as I said, the eventual game winner gets put in. So you can put the blame on the fact that the Barracuda had to switch goaltenders here, but the fact is that Duehr should not be making this mistake, and it cost the team the game here. When it comes to Colin Graf, the third player on this line, the one who is, the one to talk about, I mentioned how in Game 2 I had begun to lower my expectations. I didn't really think he would necessarily have to be incredibly dominant every single time he stepped on the ice, but at the very least he could be one of the better players for the Barracuda in all of these games. He is still one of the more talented players on this roster, and yet here tonight you're not necessarily seeing it all that often. He picks up 2 assists, so points-wise he did some good work, as the assist on the Bstedt goal and the Regenda goal, but it comes down to the 5-on-5 scoring, and you're going to hear me say this a lot for many of the different top players on this Barracuda roster. I understand the injury to Bordelot, and I understand even more so the injury to Podoralski, but at some point you need to be able to put the puck in the net 5-on-5. This is where the majority of the game is played, and right now it's just not consistent enough. The fact that the Barracuda down a goal for 17 minutes of the third period can basically generate 1 or 2 shots on net, that is just not really acceptable here if they want to have any chance of coming back in this series, and Graf should be a leader offensively, and at 5-on-5, as I've said, he has not been. When it comes to the second line here, we have Regenda with Bstedt and Gushin. I'll start off with Bstedt, who had to step into a bigger role because of the injury to Colin White. Not only did he get many shifts on this top line, but he actually got double shifted and started to play shifts with Sabourin and Vincent as well. So I imagine while we don't have any ice time available in the AHL, he's probably quite up there, I would say. And this was definitely, I feel, his best game of this series thus far. Game 1 and 2, even despite scoring that shorthanded goal, he actually wasn't all that great. Here tonight, though, I thought he was managing to keep up with the play a bit more. He found himself in some solid positions offensively. He scores a goal here on the power play. He came pretty close to scoring another couple goals as well. He got multiple shots on net, and generally I thought was just one of the Barracuda's better players. Now, I would like to mention that's not really saying all that much. The Barracuda as a whole here tonight really weren't that great. Their first period, they were completely dominated. The second period was somewhat better, but still not all that great. And then, of course, the third period was just nothing happening. And so generally the Barracuda, it wasn't even one of their better games of this playoffs thus far. But Bstedt, I think, stood out a little bit above the rest. When it comes to Danil Gushchin, a lot of the same criticisms that I gave to Colin Graf are remaining for this player. This is one of the most offensively talented players on this roster. He's a part of this top six. He's on the top power play unit as well, and they managed to score here in this game from Philip Bistet, but it is the 5-on-5 that is really mattering, and at the moment, Gushchin is just not making as much of an impact as is necessary to really give the Barracuda a strong chance. They're having too much to rely on and to lean on Yaroslav Askarov to bail them out time and time again. They need some 5-on-5 scoring, and Gushchin needs to be a player who does step out in that regard. He has at times really showcased some strong skill, but it feels as though he's trying to do too much himself, not playing off of his teammates enough. There are moments in which he's holding on the puck for too long. This was a criticism that I gave to Philip Bistet. While Gushchin does have more so of that skill ability to actually pull these types of plays off, occasionally he just loses them. Occasionally he gets knocked down. We actually saw this on the game-winning goal where he gets pressured by, in the end, like a couple of Eagles players, gets knocked down, loses the puck, and then we see Dewar come in with the mistake hit and all of that. But basically, it starts with Gushchin losing possession along the boards. This just cannot be happening. He needs to be playing better in those 5-on-5 spots if the Barracuda, again, want a chance to come back here. When it comes to the Barracuda's third line, this is where we had our two substitutions. Now, one of them was Cardwell stepping in favor of Van Roboys. This wasn't a huge surprise. Cardwell sat out game 2. It seemed as though it was a healthy scratch. Maybe it was an injury. I don't know if we ever got the clarification on that. But this is a player who was one of the more productive players for the Barracuda during the season, and so there was no way he'd be sitting out if he were actually healthy. But the other substitution is that Houle came back into the lineup in favor of Quinton Musty. Now, Musty had played game 2 in San Jose. He actually looked quite good. He was a positive impact player. Yes, he didn't score. He didn't get any points or anything like that, but he was managing to make the impact and was part of the only game that the Barracuda have won thus far in this series. And so one would think that McCarthy wouldn't want to alter the lineup all that much, and yet Musty ends up stepping out. Now, there were some potential reasons for this. The first of which is that because this game is taking place in Colorado, and there's the whole question of altitude, and you need a little bit better conditioning, and this is something that Musty is not used to, having played the last few years in the OHL. You're not traveling to Colorado. Some of these other players have played here throughout the regular season, so it is a kind of a different situation to adapt to, and maybe they didn't think he was quite ready for it. On top of that, with the fact that this is a back-to-back game, that conditioning comes even more so into question. But I feel as though the real sort of better path, I think, they could have taken is have Musty play this third game and see what happens, basically, right? Get him into the third game, and if the conditioning is a problem and he seems sluggish and he seems winded, you manage his ice time, you maybe skip a couple of shifts, give him 12, 13 minutes, whatever the case may be, and then for game 4 the very next day, that's when you make the swap to a different player. That's when you can bring Houle back into the lineup, because at the end of the day, it's very important to mention that while it is nice to see the Barracuda have success and maybe make it far into the Calder Cup playoffs, this is still ultimately a development league, and Musty is one of the top prospects for the San Jose Sharks. In fact, if you discount the players on the Sharks roster currently, like Celebrini and Smith, he's like a top 2 prospect, top 3 prospect for this team with Chernyshov and Askarov. His success is very important to this roster moving forward, and so when he puts up a good game like he did in game 2, it seems as though it would be the right situation for him to then immediately get back into game 3 and not try to really overthink this like McCarthy seems to have done. Anyway, when it comes to the actual performances of this third line, we'll highlight Ethan Cardwell, where the same criticisms, as I said, for Gushchin, the same criticisms for Colin Graf. Obviously, Cardwell is not put into as much of a position to succeed. He's not playing in the top 6, but still, this is a player who put up close to 50 points during the regular season. He can contribute, he can score, he can pick up points, and he just hasn't quite been doing that at 5-on-5. Here tonight, I do think he helped correct some of the issues he had back in game 1, where he was over-forcing plays and trying to do too much, but still, when you kind of bring that back to like a balanced level of not really doing much of anything, it's not exactly a huge positive when this is a player, again, who has put up close to 50 points thus far this season in the regular season. So, again, sounding like a broken record here, if the Barracuda are going to come back in this series, they need Cardwell, they need Gushchin, they need Graf to bring more 5-on-5 scoring. When it comes to the Barracuda's Fourth line here, Ostapchuk is, as per usual, the player I want to highlight. This was a fourth line that honestly I feel as though struggled throughout this game, in particular in the first period. It felt as though every single time they stepped on the ice, they were just absolutely hemmed into their own zone. And not just that, but they were actually just dropping assignments left and right. It was some really poor coverage. And I won't say Ostapchuk is the only run here. I think Vincent had the not so great game in that area as well. But Ostapchuk was a part of this. And for a player who had played many games in the NHL this season, it's not great to see his defense struggle on the fourth line in the AHL. Offensively, I still don't think he's contributing much. He came very close, I will say, to scoring a goal right at the end of this game, right after Regenda got the game-tying goal. That could have been the game winner if he had put it in, but the story of these playoffs thus far for Ostapchuk is missed opportunities, and it's just, if he's not actually putting the puck in, that's a real problem. I will say physically, I do think he stepped up. It was a clear message of him getting put onto this fourth line from John McCarthy to say, like, hey, you need to play better. And so I think Ostapchuk kind of woke up a little bit in terms of bringing energy, but you'd have to contribute on the scoreboard at some point. This is a player who the Barracuda need to rely on. And once again, broken record, the scoring needs to improve. When it comes to the Barracuda defensively, again, the two players to talk about, we'll start off with Luca Cagnoni. I don't think Cagnoni had a great game here tonight, which does track with the fact that the Barracuda as a whole didn't play very well. Cagnoni is kind of like a huge piece of the Barracuda offensively. We saw back against the Ontario Reign in that first playoff series that when Cagnoni is rolling, the team can also get rolling. And then we saw when maybe he's not, suddenly the offense can really struggle. And I think Cagnoni is having some issues really trying to find these openings against a stingy defense that the Eagles are offering up. And that has led to the lowered 5-on-5 scoring from this team in general. I will say, up and down game, I don't think Cagnoni played horrifically here tonight. He actually had some good standout moments. One would recall that that play where he came back on that 2-on-1 on the back check to get a stick on the puck and prevent an opportunity. But if you go back like 5 seconds, he was one of the reasons for why this 2-on-1 happened in the first place. So it's kind of a give and take in that situation. Generally, I don't think Cagnoni was bad, but you are looking for a little bit more. And then when it comes to Jack Thompson, I actually thought once more that Thompson, I didn't notice him a ton here tonight. I don't think he was as offensively capable as he was in the last game, game 2, back in San Jose. But the fact that I didn't notice him all that much is perhaps a good thing in a game in which the Barracuda were significantly hemmed into their own zone constantly. And so while I'm sure there were maybe 1 or 2 mistakes coming out from Jack Thompson for sure, I don't think it was so horrible here tonight to really point him out. Generally, relatively solid. And then when it comes to the Barracuda goaltending, I already talked about how Askarov ended up leaving this game due to minor cramps in the overtime. Prior to that, at the very least, he had been having a really good game. The first period, that first goal, didn't have much of a chance on it. The second goal, you could say he should have been able to have. I don't know if this was tipped on the way to the net, but it just barely manages to squeak through Askarov, and then Megna puts it in near the goal line. So that's a tough one, but he certainly made up for it in the second and third period, keeping the Barracuda alive, allowing them to slowly make their way back into this game. And as I've already mentioned time and time again, this is the MVP for the Barracuda. He needs to continue to be the MVP for the Barracuda. He needs to be healthy to play tomorrow to keep them alive, and then hopefully a few days later to get them the win in Game 5. If that's not the case, it's hard to see this team going any further. And then when it comes to Carrier, I already mentioned he comes in cold. Can't really put too much blame on him for that. But that will do it for this review. The Barracuda will be back in action tomorrow. As I've said, they'll have the opportunity there to keep their playoff hopes alive. This is the first actual sort of elimination game that the Barracuda have had to play here. And as is always said, the most difficult game of the season for a team is one in which they're trying to eliminate another team. So one would hope that the Barracuda can bring their A game there and they'll be able to put up a good fight. Class dismissed.